What if the airline you just booked wasn't taking you on vacation, but delivering weapons to a secret war? During the Vietnam War, that airline existed. It had offices, uniforms, and pilots in civilian clothes. It flew across Southeast Asia every single day, and it was entirely run by the CIA. Its name was Air America, and officially, it didn't exist. Welcome to the Diplomatic Archives. To understand Air America, we need to understand the world it was born into. In the early 1960s, the Cold War was dividing the planet. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a global ideological standoff, and Southeast Asia had become one of its most volatile flashpoints. In Vietnam, a communist revolutionary movement, backed by the North, was pushing southward. Washington, terrified of a domino effect, feared that the region would fall to communism. But Vietnam wasn't Washington's only problem. Right next door lay Laos, a small landlocked kingdom wedged between China, Vietnam, Thailand, and Cambodia. It had only gained full independence in 1954, following the French defeat at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. It was fragile, politically divided, and strategically critical. The North Vietnamese were using Laotian territory to move troops and supplies southward through dense jungle, along what became known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Cutting off that corridor was for Washington a matter of urgent necessity. There was just one problem. They weren't legally allowed to do anything about it. In 1962, 14 nations, including the United States, the Soviet Union, China, and North Vietnam, signed the International Agreement on the Neutrality of Laos. The deal was clear. No foreign military could station troops or establish bases on Laotian soil. Laos was to be left alone. On paper, all parties agreed. In practice, the North Vietnamese never really left. An estimated 17,000 North Vietnamese army troops were made inside the country, expanding their territorial control and supplying the Pathet Lao, a communist insurgent group allied with Hanoi. Washington watched and quietly seethed. They faced a stark set of options: openly violate the accords and face international condemnation, walk away and risk losing the region, or find a third path, something that would let them act without anyone being able to prove they were actually acting at all. Air America's origins actually predate the Vietnam War. It grew out of civil air transport, an airline originally founded in 1946 by General Claire Lee Chennault, famous for commanding the Flying Tigers during World War II. The CIA secretly purchased the company in 1950, and by 1959 had rebranded it as Air America. Its slogan, printed on company materials, was almost laughably brazen: anything, anywhere, anytime, professionally. The structure was carefully engineered for deniability. The aircraft carried no military insignia, pilots wore civilian clothing and held civilian contracts. They were not legally soldiers. If captured, the US government's position was simple: they were private contractors, employees of a commercial airline, and Washington had no involvement. In early 1970, the airline had more than 300 pilots, co-pilots, flight mechanics, and air freight specialists based across Laos, Vietnam, and Thailand, operating 24 twin-engine transports, 24 short takeoff and landing aircraft, and 30 helicopters. It was one of the largest covert logistic operations in American history, disguised as a regional airline. Every military operation needs a nerve center. For the CIA's secret war in Laos, that center was Long Ting, a remote valley base tucked into the mountains of northern Laos. Long Ting did not appear on any official map. It had no diplomatic recognition, and it didn't formally exist. Yet, at the height of the conflict, its airstrip, nestled in the jungle, became one of the busiest airports in the world, with planes taking off and landing around the clock, supplying a war that the outside world was not supposed to see. It was here that the CIA coordinated closely with General Vang Pao, an ethnic Hmong military officer who became the central figure in America's proxy war. The Hmong, a mountain-dwelling ethnic minority in northern Laos, were recruited, trained, and armed by the CIA to fight the Pathet Lao and harass North Vietnamese supply lines. By the end of 1963, a reported 20,000 Hmong were armed. They acted as guerrillas, blowing up NVA supply depots, ambushing trucks, mining roads, and generally harassing the stronger enemy force. Air America was the thread that held the entire operation together. Without its flights, the Hmong fighters would have had no ammunition, no resupply, and no way out when things went wrong. The official cover story was that Air America was a cargo and passenger airline. The reality was something altogether different. Air America crews transported tens of thousands of troops and refugees, flew emergency medevac missions, rescued downed airmen throughout Laos, inserted and extracted road watch teams, flew nighttime airdrop missions over the Ho Chi Minh Trail, monitored sensors along infiltration routes, and conducted a highly successful photo reconnaissance program. Weapons and ammunition, referred to in internal communications as, quote, hard rice, to distinguish them from actual food drops called, quote, rice drops, were airlifted to isolated mountain outposts that had no road access. In 1970 alone, Air America delivered 46 million pounds of food in Laos, where helicopter flight time reached more than 4,000 hours a month. But Air America wasn't just supplying the fight. It was actively enabling a massive bombing campaign. CIA operatives on the ground used these flights to direct airstrikes against North Vietnamese positions and supply lines throughout Laotian territory. American bombers ultimately dropped over 2 million tons of ordnance on Laos, more than all the bombs dropped during the entirety of World War II combined. More bombs than World War II on a country the size of Minnesota that was officially neutral and where the United States officially had no military presence. For the pilots flying these missions, the contradiction was impossible to ignore. They had no military status. If they were shot down, they would have no legal protections under the Geneva Convention. If they were killed, there were no military honors. Pilot Warren Erickson described a culture of secrecy so total that experienced Air America pilots, when asked about the detail of their mission by newly arrived colleagues, simply wouldn't talk. The work was never acknowledged. The danger was very real. The entire architecture of the operation rested on a single concept: plausible deniability. In never formally declaring war, the U.S. was able to sustain a massive military intervention for over a decade without public oversight. Former CIA Director Richard Helms later acknowledged that the Appropriations Subcommittee that funded the war were briefed regularly, and that senators who visited Laos gave every indication of approving what was happening, believing, Helms noted, that it was, quote, a much cheaper and better way to fight a war in Southeast Asia. Congress knew, but the American public largely did not. Air America's corporate structure wasn't just a cover story, it was a legal firewall, and it held for years. This was the birth of something new in the history of warfare, a model in which private logistics became the primary instrument of geopolitical power. The state could wage war without ever officially going to war, and if something went wrong, there was always a paper trail pointing to a private company with offices in Washington, D.C. By the mid-1970s, Air America was quietly shut down. The fall of Saigon in 1975 effectively ended the operation. Planes were sold off, records were classified. The CIA later stated that the Air America employees had conducted military activity without authority and were owed nothing beyond their civilian salaries. But the consequences didn't disappear with the paperwork. Between 1964 and 1973, more than 50,000 Lao people were killed or injured by U.S. bombs, 98% of them civilians. Today, Laos remains the most heavily bombed country per capita in the history of warfare. Of the 270 million cluster bomblets dropped on a country the size of Minnesota, roughly 30% never exploded. An estimated 80 million live bomblets remain on the ground. Approximately 200,000 Laotians were killed during the bombing, equal to around 10% of the population at the time. Even today, UXO accidents claim hundreds of lives every year. 40% of the victims are children. These are the silent, almost ironic remains of a war that, according to official documents, never happened. Air America's story leaves us with one uncomfortable truth. History isn't simply what occurs on the ground, it's a version that a government decides to make official, and sometimes a state's greatest trick isn't winning a war, it's convincing the world it never fought one.